Now, as you'll notice here, if you do have any questions, like I said, you can use your microphone if that's working for you, or just feel free to type anything into the chat box that you need. There's also the icons up at the top of the screen if you need to get my attention. But really, I want this PLC to be more of a conversation than a presentation. Really, I want to, any comments or thoughts or questions that you have, please share, or anything that's been working well in your class with Insight, or anything that's been challenging for you as we go through this. So today what we're looking at is our essential question of how can we help students use feedback effectively? I feel like in any class that you teach, self-reflection for the students is so important for them to be able to take ownership of their learning. But I feel like, I know it is from my classroom, it's one of those things that seems to get put on the back burner because we're so busy trying to teach all the important events of history and all the skills that you need for the AP test that a lot of times self-reflection gets kind of pushed back or never done at all. And so what I'm looking at today is how can we make that more of a focus in our classroom, and also how can we use Insight to do that? So you see our goals right there. Like I said, our major goal is to look at student feedback and also how to encourage student reflection. What I'm hoping is that by the end of today's meeting, you'll be able to do those 4 things. Especially number 2 and number 3, analyzing and reflecting on student progress on assessments, which of course Insight does that so well with the building block quizzes and with the next step guides. But I also want to be able to talk about modeling reflection and how do we do that in our class, and how can a teacher do that effectively in their classroom. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about metacognition. In other words, how do we get students to think about their thinking, and how do we get them to reflect on their thinking? I also want to talk about how we provide feedback, and then especially how can we use Insight to provide feedback and to work on metacognition. If you also notice there at the bottom, we'll be doing a question and answer as we go through. So again, feel free, if you have a question, please speak up or type it in the chat box. And then at the end of the night, we will do a survey to see what we can do, what we did well, and what we can improve on. So let me open up to discussion about metacognition. What does metacognition mean to you? And then why do you think it's important for students and teachers to
Well, Mason, for me, metacognition really is a student's ability to understand their own thought process. Really how they learn, is it through mnemonic devices? Is it through rote memorization? Is it through writing things down? Any one of those things for me is metacognition, and I think it's important for students to understand that, but it's really more important for teachers to understand that you have a room full of students. I have 40 in one class for my AP World History class, and I could very well have I could have 40 different ways of thought processes, or just 2 or 3. So the students need to be able to share that with each other, so that their peers understand how they learn, and if they have very similar metacognition or very similar thought processes, that really lends to peer reflection or peer editing, if those are tools you want to use in your class.
I think it's important that they take time to reflect and understand how they're learning something, and if they're not, to kind of put the brakes on and then
and I think the reflection part for students is hard, just like it's hard for adults. One thing I bring up with my students on a regular basis.
Anna, do you mind kind of expanding on that? What do you mean when we talk about reflection in your classroom?
Else, but you need to learn how to critique yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone use peer editing in their class?
Anna, did you have any other thoughts on that? I do, yeah. And again, mainly when it comes to essays or for writing thesis statements or things like that. But I think I want to be more. Um, I don't know what's the word. I'm trying to think of the word I'm thinking of here. More efficient with that, but and giving feedback and having them really think about how are they thinking, and kind of pulling back the curtain on their thoughts. There's a couple of ways that we can do this in our classrooms. First of all, this is so tough for students to speak up when they're having issues and they in something. But really doing your best to kind of encourage students to talk about when they're struggling. What's confusing them? What do they not understand? And also speaking up and saying, here's a way that we can learn this information to make it more relevant to us. The other thing I think we really need to kind of think about when it comes to metacognition is how do we do that when we hand back assignments to students or when we do graded work? For me, that first question is a question I really want to ask my students is, how confident were you with your answers? Even the ones you got right. Do you understand why you got it right? I feel like sometimes, I think of like a basketball game when a player puts up a shot, just chunks it towards the goal, and it happens to go in. Well, it's sort of like getting a question right on a test. Yeah, you got A, but do you understand why you got that question right? What are of those questions that are up there, which ones do y'all often use with students?
I know that I've used question 3 that's on there. Yeah. In preparing for this PLC today, I really have noticed that my students need more assistance in understanding historical context and in reviewing this, getting ready for this PLC today, I noticed
Sorry, Brian, can you repeat that? I was having trouble hearing
my students have a real issue with periodization and historical context with regards to content. They either overlap periods or they're not even in the same hemisphere with regards to the period. And so I think that number 3 and 4, as Anna said, that those are really good places where students can learn how to explain their reasoning. And maybe that will help them with historical context as well as content.
And also just like the converse to that is explaining why they got something wrong, what their thinking was that had them select a wrong answer. Sometimes that's a real way of getting to their understanding. Like, why did you choose the answer and it was wrong? And sometimes we learn from our mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. It might
No
just be
problem.
me, but Anna and Brian, both of y'all were cutting out when you're talking. So I'm trying to hear you, and I think I understood what y'all were saying. But if I skip over something, I apologize on that. Another thing I think is another thing I think is really important in class is modeling our own thinking in front of the students. And again, sort of pulling back the curtain in our classroom of what we are thinking as we teach this. Or also showing students our struggles that we go through with difficult material. I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, the whole story in the news about gravitational waves come out and how scientists have discovered these. And I thought that was just the coolest thing ever, but I don't understand any of it, if I'm being honest. I think it's really cool. It's like, oh, this is so awesome that Einstein had this theory and now we're proving it. And it was funny because my son was doing a report on Einstein for his school. So I was trying to understand it. I'm doing my best, but it's tough to understand. And I started to tell my classes this, that I would find an article about gravitational waves and for me to try and read it took a long time, and I really had to think about it. And I wanted to show them, though, that struggle that we all go through when we're dealing with material that's new to us, especially something like AP World, when we're introducing them to concepts, places, or ideas that they've
Well,
never dealt
Mason,
with
you're kind of
before.
cutting out on us too, but on me anyway. But I do the same thing, and I start a lot of my
Is there a
conversations
way
with
that
my
y'all
classes
model
with, I heard
your
this on
thinking processes in your
NPR,
class?
or I heard this on the radio on my way in. After my students get over the shock that I don't listen to music on my way into work, then we're able to really go through, and I'm able to explain that I have to read and be constantly looking for material, or else I'm going to fall behind with what's important, relevant, and really how the worldview is being shaped by those that are living it. And so I've encouraged my students to read the newspaper, or listen to the radio, whatever way they can get information. And that's the way that I model it. And I think you're right. World history, AP World History anyway, it's not only daunting for the students, it's daunting for us to keep it all straight and understand all the periods and really convey the most important elements that will be on the AP exam that they are going to take.
I think it's also when someone asks the question, and if you really don't know the answer, if somebody asks a question and you don't know the answer, to be able to say, I don't know the answer. Why don't we find out together?
Yeah. That's actually a great technique to say, I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
One of the things I found is when I come across something that was different from the way it was when we learned it, was like with the death of King Tut, how after it came over here with the tour, they found that it was
right, and then kind of modeling, how
post-mortem wound to the head, and then he died from an impacted tooth. Shows how that even though this is something accepted, we can still learn from new science and have to accept changes to what we thought was in the past.
Yeah, that's an excellent point too. That And I've been there too with my students, trying to explain to them that when I learned world history 20, 30 years ago, it was different than what we're learning in 2016, for sure. So let's talk about feedback.
With
also,
essays, I find it a lot easier because
when
if
you're
you
giving feedback to students, whether it's from an assignment,
when you're commenting on the writing
class,
about what they missed, you can always ask them.
How can you
I've
use
done this in the past, where you tell them, okay, now look at your essay, look where I've made comments about what you did earn, and where I say something like almost or not quite. You're missing something. How could you have changed what you wrote to earn the point there, or to get credit for that idea? And make them think about what they're actually doing or were doing at the time.
Yeah, I do the same thing that Joseph does with this whole class discussion about essays. Everybody look at their essay, look at the rubric, and look at the comments, and what do you think we need to focus on? Do we need to focus on thesis writing? Do we need to focus on grouping if it's a DBQ? Do we need to work on historical context if it's a CCOT? Whatever the essay is that we're working on. And I think that whole class puts takes a little bit of pressure off of individual students as they're looking at their essay, and it's all marked up, and they maybe have gotten 2 points out of the 7 possible points. Because then they don't feel like they're the only one, and they don't feel singled out within the class.
One of the things I learned from John, I guess maybe 2-3 years ago, at a I'm sorry. What one of the things John said was to have them, when they're taking quizzes or tests, write down what they're thinking on it, so that when we go back over it and they didn't get it right, we can talk about, okay, well, why did you miss it? What were you looking at?
Stated.
What led you astray? Which one of the distractors, or what of the distractor made you think that was a better answer? And I'd never done that before, and I've gotten pretty good results with it. Making them, because they're looking at not just why is this the best answer, why was I distracted by another one?
Yeah, those are good ideas. And by the way, guys, I apologize. I feel like everyone's cutting out on my speakers, and I'm not sure why. So I'm hearing bits and pieces of everything that y'all say, and I like the bits and pieces that I'm hearing. But unfortunately, I'm not getting the whole story sometimes. But I'll see what I can do on my end. Yeah, when we think about feedback, and I know you've seen this before in all kinds of professional development, that we always say feedback needs to be timely, specific, and action-oriented, but obviously that's easier said than done. When you have 180 AP students and 180 essays to grade, it's kind of hard to give that feedback real timely. And the students, I know, I had that issue of when I do have a big stack of essays, I try to put it off as long as I can. So I know that my struggle is definitely with being timely. But the good thing is with Insight, there are ways to do that much more effectively. And we're going to take a look at each of these 3 things here: the student progress sheets, the performance task rubrics, and then those next step guides to help you and ultimately the students. So you've seen the student progress sheets if you've been using Insight in your class. And you know that on those progress sheets, there are two parts to them. The first part is the misunderstanding check, which I've always liked to do at the beginning of a building block, but then I was talking
I
to some other
typically use
teachers,
these progress sheets. I typically use them at the end.
So just curious, what are y'all's thoughts on that? Do you use it at the beginning of a building block, at the end?
I'm not using Insight as much as maybe some of you are, but I am using it. And the key way that I use it, I focus on ACT resources, and I do a lot of things after I've taught a certain lesson, because it's, for me, it allows me to focus the students on areas that they need to look at and skills that they need to look at to build on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. And I do like that this piece is pretty flexible, that you could use it at the beginning or the end. I think either way works well. The other part I really like about the misunderstanding check is that the students have to write the reasoning down also. They can't just agree or disagree. They have to give that reason why. And again, getting back to what is your thinking in your metacognition.
I typically share all of the rubrics with my students. I think it's important for them to understand the expectations that the College Board has for AP exams, and the expectations that I'm looking for.
The other thing we have, of course, are the performance task rubrics with each building.
I use rubrics, now, all rubrics, and I share all of them
directly with your students, or do you kind of summarize them?
Just because they need to understand the level of expectation going in.
In my using of it, mainly because I'm limited to just the paper end of it due to several of my students not having internet access. I was just saying, due to the limitations, because so many of my students don't have internet access beside their phone at home, I'm using pretty much primarily paper. I can't afford the copies to give everybody a copy, so I'll tell them the general idea of it, main things we're focusing on, but I don't personally hand them a copy.
Yeah. Well, and I'm fortunate that all of my students have iPads in our school district.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Before we go too far,
sometimes with
I'm not a fan of the
Sorry, go ahead.
We still make copies, and the AP department, we got together with our administrators and asked for a bulk of our budget to be for copies. So I'm able to hand my students these rubrics, not for every single performance task, but for for certain ones.
Yeah, and that makes sense too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that goes back to reasoning. Joseph's idea that he shared that when the students are taking a test or they're writing an essay, that they write their reasoning down as to how they got there, and that's self-reflective and self-evaluation.
So I think, as a practical matter, I don't know that you can make copies of every single one of every task, but I do like the idea of summarizing the rubric and sharing that with students, because you want students to sort of be self-evaluating themselves as they go through the task, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most definitely. I would agree with that. Now, the next steps guide, this is what I really, really like. And I use this as much as I can in my classroom anytime we finish with a
Yeah,
task.
I use the ACT resources, I
And
think,
this
more
is a
than
piece I
more
think
than
that
any of.
really helps give students ownership of their learning, because you really can tailor it to each and every student and really have them kind of give themselves feedback also.
I was saying that this is the
When
one
you think
ACT
about it,
resources. That is
it
the
really
one
does sort of
resource that I
encourage
use
a collaborative
most of all out of
environment
all the
between you
resources on
and
AP
each of your
Insight,
students.
because it really pinpoints what the students
So
need to
here's the
focus
next
on.
steps guide. If you haven't
And
seen it
my
or been
students
able
seem to
to
like
use it
them. They
yet,
seem to like reading articles
there's a student version
and
and a teacher
discussing the
version.
articles with their
And by the way, if you
classmates and
haven't
with the
looked at these
class
yet, you
as a
can
whole,
download them down at the bottom
and
under
answering the
materials.
questions. And I really enjoy using the ACT resources.
I'm sorry, Brian, can you repeat that? I couldn't hear you. Um, yeah, and again, here you have with the next steps guide, you really want students to be able to analyze and reflect on what they've learned.
Yes.
And this takes time. I mean, I like
But
using it
some
in
of the ACT
class, but
resources
you got to kind of make a
that
commitment
I
to
worked
say, yes,
on,
we are going to do this. It is
I had them
worth
doing a lot of stuff
our valuable
outside.
class
Go
time
home and
to
listen to
do
this
it.
podcast that
And
I
I know that's
found,
going to be, a
or go home
challenge
and look
because
at
we've
this
got a
interactive
lot of
map, which I'm
skills and a
aware
lot of
that's not
history to
easy to do
cover.
for some students,
But,
but
I've told my students, this is
I don't have
important,
to always
and they
take
know
time
it's
out of
important
class
because
to
I'm
use an
taking
ACT
time out of
resource,
class to do it.
which is another reason I like using them, because I'm making them independent learners, because at this point all of their essays are in class. So they're not going home and
Brian, this is what you were
researching a
talking about,
DBQ
right? The
essay
ACT
or a
resources?
CCOT essay. They get 40 minutes to do it in class, and what they complete in class is what's graded.
Understanding the process, for sure. But I feel like you have to make that commitment at the beginning, because this is also a process that some students haven't seen ever, especially in other classes. know Brian shared a couple things, and I shared a couple, but does anybody do anything differently? So no, am I cutting out too? Are y'all having the same problem hearing me?
Yeah. Mason, I'm getting about every fifth word, I guess. It's pretty bad.
Okay. Sounds like we're having some technical difficulties all across the board tonight. Yeah, and I'm feeling that same way about the buffering. I noticed a couple times when someone was talking, they would cut out for a couple seconds, but then come back and they were saying the same sentence. So I'll continue on. But if you have any thoughts or need me to stop, don't forget also those icons at the top.
Chris, is there some way that can we restart this and maybe it'll work again, or what do you?
Yeah, Brian, I heard you talking. I think you were talking to Chris, but I couldn't quite hear you. That's it. Let me go ahead and move on. We'll go through some of these other questions.
Yeah, I was asking Chris
a couple of questions that have come up a lot
got a magic
when talking about this. And the first one's one that we've already talked about of, how do you find the time to do it? And again, I think it's going to be a time investment at the beginning, for sure, like we mentioned, especially because students have not been through this process before. But if you put in the time at the beginning of the year, I think after a while, when students do get comfortable with it, it's something you can do for homework. Or you can do it in class, but do it a lot quicker. Now, of course, the second question is one that we run into a lot too about what do we do if students don't take it seriously? And, of course, we have AP students, so usually they do all their work, but we know that's not always the case. So I'll open it up. What do y'all do if you have a student who is either not doing this reflection or is maybe running through it real haphazardly and you can tell they're not really taking time to think about it? And you might want to type your answers in the chat box because it sounds like our audio is having problems. So I'll give everybody a second if you want to type in there.
I've tried the one-on-one approach.
Yeah, Joseph, I like that idea of group accountability also. Small groups can be really effective with this. And maybe having students try it out by themselves, but also sharing with a small group. And it can be friends that they feel comfortable with sharing.
Well, I'm not sure about the rest of you, but my students have been going to school with each other since the second or third grade. So these are students who know each other really well, and really don't have that many problems with calling each other out on mistakes that they've made. And so that's why peer reflection and group reflection has worked well for me, because I have a lot of outspoken students. So I'm not sure if you have, if the rest of you have that experience.
Get to know each other, that does work very well. You're right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess it sort of also depends on the personality of your students and how comfortable they do feel.
Well, and I think it's also if it's something that you utilize on a regular basis, then it's something that they get comfortable with doing over time. Go ahead.
No, Brian, you were saying doing it on a regular basis?
Well, I wouldn't do it I wouldn't do it every week, but if you do it enough, then they just grow more comfortable with it.
Yeah, for sure. Because again, this is something that they probably have not experienced before. Or at least they haven't had to deal with this kind of feedback that's purposefully before.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I'm sure teachers in their past have.
I do have to agree with familiarity with the process, because even your shy students will come out.
Yeah. And hopefully you can get those shy students out. Although I'll be honest, I got a couple this year. They don't want to talk to me. They don't want to talk to anybody. They'll sit and do the work, but they do not want to talk.
Yeah.
All right, so let's take a look back at.
Well, and I think we have to remember that our students are
Okay, so let's look back at our question that we started with today of how we can use feedback. What strategies or ideas have you thought about tonight that you want to start trying in your classroom? And if you would, go ahead and type it in the chat box. Also, we're beginning to come to a close, so as people are typing in their strategies, if you have any other questions that we haven't addressed tonight, feel free to type those into the chat box also. I'll give everybody another second if you need to type in any questions. Yeah, Anna, to answer your question about the iPads, most the performance tasks are in PDF form, so I don't know that they can write right into the document. They could type it somewhere else. And yeah, Joseph, you are right. All the quizzes can be done on iPads. They can be done on phones. Yeah, it does work well. I've had my students do it on their phones too, since we don't have iPads in our school.
I have allowed my students to do the quizzes on their iPad, and it works well.
I know that if I try and do it on my phone, I'm scrolling between the reading and the questions, but it doesn't seem to bother the students at all. I guess they're a little more used to working on their phones than than I am. So if you have any more questions, again, feel free to type those in. But I do want to remind you of the resources that are down at the bottom of your window under Reading Materials. The PowerPoint that we used today is down there. Those next step guides, which of course are on the AP Insight website, but you can find them down below also. And then we are going to have a recording of this session that'll be up on the website soon. So if you know anybody who missed it that you think might benefit from it, please let them know. Also, I want to put a plug in for the AP Insight message board that I'm also a moderator for. So if you have any other thoughts or comments, or you want to continue this discussion, please go post there. We've got a couple people that have shared ideas or asked questions, but I really want to see more and kind of have this conversation continuing throughout the school year. So please go in. It's right under Share What Works on the AP Insight website. All right. Also, there's a survey here that we would like you to take about this evening. So I'm going to put this... no, I'm not able to. I'm on my wife's Mac, so I cannot... I was going to try and copy and paste it into the chat box, but that's not working. Anyway, it's right there. If you would go to that site and give us some feedback on tonight. Also, if you want CEU credit, you'll need to fill that out. If you do need any other help with Insight or have any questions, you can always email Insight or give them a call. By the way, they are also doing office hours Monday afternoons from 4 to 5 Eastern on Mondays. And if you go to the main page on Insight, there's a link there, and every Monday they'll have something that looks like this opened up, and you can go in, ask questions. And I'm sure it'll work perfectly. All right, so that's the end. I've got nothing else. But if you have any other questions, please, I'll be sticking around for a few minutes. Feel free to type in the chat box. Oh, thank you, Chris. There's the SurveyMonkey link. I'll be sticking around for the next few minutes to answer any questions. So feel free to type anything into the chat box. And thank you all so much. Anna, that's a really good question. Chris, would you be able to answer that? Or do you know who she can contact to answer that? Because I don't know. Also, I want to put the plug in if someone is going out there to do lead a one-on-one training, I would like to do that.
Would I contact Elaine?
I would believe Elaine's in charge of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
If in doubt, contact Ivana. She'll put you in touch with the right person.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to sign off.